A cop threatened his black son, but he unleashed 22 lawsuits that buried their careers. A cop unleashed a K-9 on his black son, thinking no one would intervene. He didn't realize the father was about to unleash 22 lawsuits and bury careers in the process. The moment the dog lunged, the cabin's balance of power flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The patrol car door creaked open, slicing through the still air with a sound sharper than its volume. Marcus Hale's posture tightened instinctively. He hadn't expected this. Not here, not now. He shifted slightly, placing his arm in front of his 14-year-old son, Jalen, who stood frozen on the edge of the sidewalk. A low, taut voice called out across the small stretch of pavement, "You two, stop right there." Marcus turned his head, slowly, deliberately, locking eyes with the officer who had just stepped out of the car. Grant Veller, mid-30s, broad stance, a leash wrapped tightly in his left fist, connected to a German shepherd whose muscles rippled beneath its vest as it pulled slightly forward, nostrils flaring. "We're just headed to the track," Marcus said, his voice calm, not raised, as if lowering the pitch could de-escalate whatever this was before it started. "My son has practice at the Northbridge complex." Veller didn't reply immediately. He studied them, eyes darting from Marcus's hand to Jalen's jacket, then back to the subtle way Marcus positioned himself between the boy and the dog. The silence stretched. The dog's paws scraped softly on the sidewalk. Jalen shifted closer to his father, voice uncertain. "Dad?" Marcus didn't look away from the officer. "Just stay right here, son." The K-9 whined, sensing the rise in tension. Its head tilted slightly, catching the scent of nervous adrenaline. Jalen's breath had shortened. Marcus could feel it, the shift in air pressure when an ordinary moment turns. His fingers flexed slightly, noting the red light blinking on the officer's body cam. Above them, a storefront's security camera faced the street. Another one, behind them, was mounted above the bank's ATM. He'd counted them already. He always did. Jalen had teased him for it just minutes ago. "You always do that," Jalen had laughed, zipping up his track jacket. "Count cameras and exits like we're in a spy movie." "Habit," Marcus had replied with a half-smile. "And habit keeps you alive." Now the habit felt like armor. "Need to see some ID," Veller barked. "Both of you." Marcus remained still. "He's a minor. I can provide mine." "You'll both provide what I ask," the officer snapped, stepping closer. The dog surged forward an inch and Marcus caught the twitch of the handler's wrist, controlled, but impatient. He recognized that posture. It wasn't about law. It was about control. Marcus reached slowly into his pocket, withdrawing his wallet and holding it up for clarity before unfolding it. He removed his ID and extended it at chest level. "Marcus Hale. This is my son, Jalen Hale. We're headed to the athletic field for his practice." The officer barely looked at the card. His gaze remained fixed on the pair of them, scanning for something Marcus knew wasn't there. Resistance, aggression, non-compliance? No, just two black males walking through a neighborhood where lawns were trimmed and quiet was expected. "What's in the bag?" Veller nodded toward the backpack slung over Jalen's shoulder. "Track shoes and a water bottle," Jalen said quietly. "Don't speak unless spoken to," the officer snapped. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the sharp flare in his chest but keeping it from his voice. "Officer," he said, "is there a specific concern? You haven't stated a reason for this stop." "Your tone's a little practiced," Veller muttered. Marcus didn't respond to that. There was nothing to gain by playing verbal chess with someone already trying to flip the board. He simply stood, his body angled just slightly, enough to shield Jalen's torso without making the gesture look confrontational. But Veller saw it anyway. "You're obstructing," the officer said, tightening the leash in one hand. The dog's ears perked up at the motion. "No, sir. I'm standing with my son. I'm complying fully. You're the one elevating the situation." You watch your mouth. A man across the street slowed his walk. Another paused at the corner. A car turned too quickly and reversed course. People were noticing. The dog began pacing. Nose low to the ground, movements tight, controlled, alert, but not calm. Marcus knew enough about K9 training to see it. The animal was picking up on its handler's energy, not any external threat. That made it more dangerous, not less. Jalen's fingers clutched his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, eyes wide. Marcus whispered back, barely moving his lips. "Don't run. Don't speak. Don't flinch." Officer Veller took another step forward, face hardening, voice louder now, broadcasting to everyone and no one. "Last warning. You either back up, or I take that as defiance." Marcus said nothing. The line had already been crossed. He looked up briefly at the blinking red light of the body cam and said clearly, "Storefront camera 1, active. Body cam, active. Audio, capturing all commands." Veller flinched slightly, uncertain whether to see that as compliance or challenge. The air around them thickened. Jalen's breathing became shallow. The dog let out a low, guttural growl, more noise than threat, but enough to draw gasps from a pair of teens now recording from across the street. Marcus stood still, unmoving, unshaken. Every instinct in him screamed to raise his voice, to demand reason, to throw the law back in the officer's face. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not with Jalen beside him. One wrong breath would become a weapon. The officer's face twitched with restrained impatience. His hand hovered near the harness clip. Jalen's eyes locked on the dog. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the officer. Neither moved. But the moment did. The weight of it. The gravity of tension that pushed down on every chest, watching, recording, whispering. Some moments arrive quietly, but they never leave the same way. Officer Veller's voice cuts sharply through the afternoon air. Identification. Now. The command is louder than the moment requires, carrying across the sidewalk and pulling the attention of strangers who slow their steps, their curiosity sharpening into concern. Marcus Hale stops without hesitation. He does not raise his hands, does not bristle, does not argue. He reaches calmly into his jacket and produces his identification, holding it out at chest height. His face remains composed, but his eyes never leave the officer's posture, the angle of his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. "We're heading to the athletic complex," Marcus says evenly, his tone respectful and controlled. "Public access. Practice starts in 20 minutes. His voice is measured, deliberate, stripped of emotion. The response does not settle the situation. It worsens it. Officer Veller's expression hardens, as if calm itself were suspicious. He does not take the ID immediately. Instead, his gaze drifts past Marcus and locks onto Jalen. The boy instinctively shifts closer to his father, fingers brushing the fabric of Marcus's sleeve. His breathing grows shallow. His only objective is proximity. Stay close, stay unseen, stay safe. "Where are you coming from?" the officer asks, already stepping closer. "Home," Marcus answers. "Where exactly?" "Northbridge," Marcus replies, noticing the subtle shift in the questions, the way they move away from purpose and toward assumption. Dramatic irony hums beneath the exchange. Marcus recognizes the pattern instantly, the absence of reasonable suspicion, the escalating tone without cause, the deliberate stretching of authority. He has seen this sequence before, diagrammed it in reports, warned municipalities about it in closed rooms years ago. Yet the officer in front of him believes he is fully in control, unaware that every word is being weighed. The dog begins to pace. Its movement is tight and restless, claws clicking softly against the pavement as it circles within the range of the leash. The animal is not reacting to Marcus or Jalen. It is responding to tension, its handler's grip, the sharpness in the air, the lack of clarity in command. Marcus notices immediately. "Is this interaction being recorded?" Marcus asks quietly. The question lands heavier than its volume suggests. Officer Veller pauses. His eyes flick briefly toward his body camera. The leash tightens in his hand. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty surfaces, then disappears. "Stand where you are," the officer snaps, his voice rising again. He keys his radio without explanation. "Dispatch, send another unit." There is no resistance, no threat, no movement toward the officer. And yet the stakes jump instantly. Pedestrians hesitate now, caught between instinct and fear. Some slow, others turn away. No one speaks. "Don't move," Officer Veller orders. A second later he adds, "Step back." Jalen freezes, confusion flooding his face. He does not know which instruction to obey. His feet shift, then stop. Panic flickers in his eyes. Marcus reacts immediately, not with force, but with placement. He steps slightly forward, angling his body between his son and the dog, one hand extending subtly behind him to guide Jalen back without contact. His voice remains calm, but urgency threads through it. "My son is trying to comply," Marcus says. "Please give one clear instruction." The handler does not hear reason. He sees obstruction. "Don't interfere," Officer Veller warns, tightening his grip on the leash. The dog responds instantly, muscles coiling, energy spiking. The leash is no longer restraint, it is leverage. Jalen stumbles backward, fear breaking through control. Marcus anchors his stance, every sense focused, every decision calculated. He does not shout. He does not plead. He speaks clearly, deliberately. "Marcus Hale, Northbridge Ward, 14-year-old minor present. Time is 14:37, he says aloud, ensuring the audio captures every word. The air feels thinner now, heavier. The officer's jaw tightens. His final warning comes fast, sharp, and without explanation, an authority unmoored from reason, a moment slipping toward danger. When confusion replaces reason, authority becomes its own threat. The bark came first, sharp, trained, cutting through the static tension like a serrated knife. Then the leash snapped taut. The dog lunged. Marcus saw the shift in muscle before he heard the officer's command. A half-second of instinct pulled his focus downward, but it wasn't fast enough. Jalen screamed, not from injury, but from raw panic, as his foot slipped on the pavement. He fell hard, hands scraping against the curb's rough edge, knees folding under him. The dog's teeth flashed, inches from contact, jaws opening wide with the unmistakable intention of subduing, not assessing. "Jalen!" Marcus's voice tore through the air, low but unmistakably firm, rooted in something ancient. His body reacted before thought could intervene. He dropped to a knee, swept Jalen backward with his left arm, and placed his entire frame in the direct path of the oncoming K-9 unit. The leash strained like a cable under stress, the dog's breath wet and fast. Marcus planted his right hand out, palm open, not as a barrier but as a command posture. "Stand down," he barked, not to the officer but to the dog. For a fraction of a second, the impossible happened. The dog stopped. Not fully, not calmly, but enough. Its front paws skidded against the pavement, nostrils flaring, growl rumbling like a storm cloud caught between instincts. The officer shouted again, another command meant to reinforce control, but it came out jagged, too loud, too late. The K-9's ears flicked, but not toward the handler, toward Marcus. Around them, the atmosphere twisted. A woman gasped behind a parked car. Someone further away shouted, "Hey, what's happening?" The distant sound of approaching sirens filtered in like warning drums, but Marcus's world narrowed to 3 points. His son trembling behind him, the dog still bristling in front of him, and the officer whose grip had whitened around the leash. Jalen whimpered, "Dad, it almost bit me." "I know," Marcus whispered without looking back. "Stay low. Keep breathing. I've got you." The officer took a single step forward, eyes narrowed. "Back away from the animal. You're interfering with a lawful—" "You've already lost control," Marcus said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. But something about the cadence, the unshaken calm, made the officer flinch. The dog shifted again, caught in the friction of training versus instinct. It growled, but did not lunge. Its head lowered, eyes locking on Marcus's. For the second time, the animal seemed to pause, not confused, but as if reconsidering. And the cameras saw it all. Mounted atop a storefront awning, a round black lens tracked the scene. Another blinked red across the street. Phones had begun to rise, too. 3, 4, maybe 5 people now recording, no longer just witnesses, but documentarians of a moment spiraling toward infamy. The tension was not broken. It was sharpened. The officer gritted his teeth. "Dog! Engage!" "No!" Marcus's voice cracked the moment open like thunder. Not shouted, but commanding enough that even the crowd flinched. "That's a child. You do not get to write the rules mid-attack." The officer faltered. Just a step. Just a moment. But it was enough. Marcus angled his body slightly, ensuring Jalen remained visible, not just to the handler but to every camera within line of sight. His brain worked faster than adrenaline would allow, already calculating how the footage would be interpreted. He widened his stance, exposed his hands, made no sudden movements. Control was not an option. It was the only defense. The sirens came closer now, a chorus of escalation. Tires screeched on asphalt as backup neared. The dog whimpered, confused by the layers of noise, human emotion, and conflicting cues. "Why isn't the dog listening to you?" someone yelled from across the street. The officer didn't answer. He yanked hard on the leash instead, dragging the animal half a step back, then forward again. The dog, agitated, growled louder. Its indecision was now a mirror to its handler's confusion. What had begun as overreach was quickly unraveling into instability. Marcus lowered his tone. "Look at me," he said to the dog, not the man. "You're not at war. You're being misused." The dog let out a short, frustrated bark but didn't attack. Its claws clicked on the pavement. For a breathless instant, its posture broke, not submission, but pause. Then came the second command. "Engage! Engage now!" The leash jerked again, and that was the breaking point. From the corner of Marcus's eye, he saw the phones rise higher. He saw a man in a blue hoodie press record. He saw a teenager whisper, "Is he really making the dog attack them?" He saw one camera zoom in on Jalen's scraped hands, his trembling shoulders. The dog bared its teeth, but again hesitated. The chaos in its training was now laid bare. Marcus whispered, "This isn't on you, boy." His voice didn't quiver. It didn't rise. It just was, the only stable thing in a moment that was falling apart. His hand remained out. His stance remained open. And yet, he was immovable. The officer's jaw clenched. Rage, confusion, and panic twisted across his face. He tugged again, ready to force the dog forward. But in the second before contact, the growing crowd began to murmur, a ripple of concern turning into something louder. 3 voices spoke at once. "You can't do that. He's a kid." "Stop the dog. Someone call a supervisor." Everything was shifting now. The authority once held by a badge and a leash was being pried apart by visibility and truth. And in the eye of it all, Marcus stood his ground. The moment stretched, taut, dangerous, silent. A breath waiting to be broken. Every heartbeat in the scene felt like a decision, and the cameras were still rolling. Fear spread faster than the dog, but control held its ground. The first officer to step out of the arriving squad car didn't draw his weapon, but he didn't lower his hand from his belt either. The second trailed behind, younger, uncertain, glancing between the tense dog, the straining leash, and the man shielding his son. Marcus Hale didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply shifted slightly, ensuring his voice projected evenly without sounding confrontational. "A minor was just endangered," Marcus said, his tone firm but devoid of panic. "And I want that logged before anyone tries to reframe what's happening here." His words landed with a weight that caught the younger officer off guard. Jalen remained behind him, still crouched slightly, breath shallow and rapid. The dog had been reined in only seconds ago, but the air remained charged. The original handler, Officer Grant Veller, stood off to the side, fists clenched, jaw rigid, still trying to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled beyond him. His eyes darted between his colleagues, searching for validation or backup. The first new officer, a man in his 40s with a square jaw and the beginning of silver at his temples, stepped closer to Veller. "What's the code here?" he asked, quiet enough that Marcus could barely make it out. "Interference, refusal to comply, escalation risk," Veller said too quickly, too vaguely. Marcus noted the shift in posture from the others. Doubt. That was the first crack. He leaned slightly to the right and saw something peculiar. One of the new officers reached toward the dog's harness, tapping at a small device mounted atop it. A red light blinked off. The camera had been disabled. Marcus said nothing. He just blinked slowly, storing the detail in the vault of his memory. "Sir," the younger officer said, finally addressing Marcus directly, "we need you to step aside so we can separate parties for safety, just until a supervisor arrives." "No," Marcus replied calmly. "I won't step away from my son. You can ask me anything you need right here, but he doesn't leave my sight." The officers exchanged looks. Even Veller shifted uncomfortably. Around them, bystanders had begun gathering in tighter clusters. Cell phones were visible now, some recording openly, others pretending not to, while cameras were clearly running. The moment was no longer owned by the officers. It belonged to the public. "Is there a supervisor en route?" Marcus asked clearly, voice cutting through the murmurs. 10 seconds out," the senior officer muttered into his shoulder radio. Jalen shifted slightly behind his father, his fingers brushing against the back of Marcus's coat. That touch grounded Marcus more than any law ever had. Then the supervisor arrived. A tall man with a deliberate gait and trimmed beard stepped from a separate vehicle, surveying the scene with quiet urgency. His eyes swept from the dog to the leash to the faces of every man in uniform. When he reached Marcus and Jalen, his brow furrowed. "I'm Lieutenant Revan Kaur," he said, approaching with hands visible. "Tell me what happened." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his body slightly, making sure the cameras, storefront, streetlight, and cell phones had a clear view of his face. "This officer," Marcus said, pointing directly at Veller, "unleashed a dog on a nonviolent minor without cause. He ignored protocol, failed to de-escalate, and radioed for backup before any threat existed." Lieutenant Kaur turned to Veller. "Is your body cam on?" Veller hesitated. "Yes, it was." "Still recording?" "Yes." "And the K9 camera?" The other officer who had tapped the harness shifted uncomfortably. "Turn it back on," Kaur said sharply. "From now until this scene is cleared, all devices remain active. Understood?" The order sent a ripple through the gathered officers. Veller said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any denial. Kaur stepped between Marcus and the dog, signaling for the animal to be fully restrained and removed from proximity. The handler obeyed, jaw tight, and led the now calmer dog back toward a patrol car. It was the first signal that control was shifting. "Mr. Hale, we need to separate you and your son briefly to ensure statements are taken correctly," Kaur said, tone even. "You have my word, he stays in sight." Marcus hesitated. It was the first moment his composure wavered. His jaw tensed, but his eyes found Jalen's. "You okay?" Jalen nodded, still wide-eyed, voice barely audible. "Yeah." Marcus allowed the separation, but only after positioning himself at a specific angle, one where every camera could still see them both. He tracked the distance, calculated the margin, and only then stepped aside. The crowd, once silent, began murmuring again, some encouraging, some concerned, all watching. Phones continued recording. Every movement mattered. Lieutenant Corr turned to an officer behind him and spoke clearly. "Secure the dog. No more proximity to civilians." Another small but irreversible shift. A father had drawn a line, and now the institution was being forced to measure itself against it. The sidewalk no longer belonged to protocol, it belonged to witness. And then the moment settled, not with resolution, but with a shift in balance. Once witnesses stand still, truth starts moving on its own. Marcus Hale's hand still hovered protectively in front of his son's chest when the paramedics arrived, their uniforms sharp against the fading light, their pace brisk and wordless. The dog had been leashed and removed, but its presence lingered like smoke, unseen but suffocating. One of the responders, a tall man with a short buzz cut and a worn badge clipped to his belt, crouched beside Jalen, who was seated on the curb, trembling. The boy's track jacket had ripped at the elbow, and thin streaks of blood laced the scrape along his forearm. Dirt clung to his palms where they'd slammed against the pavement. His breathing came shallow and quick. "We're going to check you out, son," the medic said gently. "Just sit still, all right?" Jalen nodded silently. Marcus stood behind him, eyes scanning every angle of the scene, lips tight. The officer who initiated the incident, Veller, stood off to the side, arms crossed, speaking softly into his shoulder radio. His stance was defensive, his jaw clenched with the kind of tightness that tried to mask error beneath authority. But Marcus wasn't watching Veller out of fear. He was studying him, cataloging him, like a case study he had once lectured on. A younger officer stepped closer to Marcus, holding a small notepad. "Sir, we're going to need a brief statement," he said, tone measured but unsure. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Marcus Hale. My son's name is Jalen Hale. We were walking to the athletic complex. The dog was released without warning. No provocation." The officer scribbled. "And the name of the officer who—" "Grant Veller," Marcus answered flatly. "Badge number 2184. The body cam light was red. The command was verbal, not reactive. The leash was used as intimidation, not restraint." The officer looked up, startled. Marcus's voice hadn't risen, but its clarity carved through the air like glass. "Would you like to provide a written statement now, or—" "I will, but first, I'm requesting on record the name and badge of every officer currently present, the K-9 unit's handler file, the incident code this is being filed under, and confirmation that all footage from the scene, including street-side cameras, be preserved." The young officer blinked, then nodded slowly, realizing this wasn't a typical interaction. I'll have to confirm with my supervisor." "You do that," Marcus said. Behind him, the paramedics finished bandaging Jalen's arm and began checking his vitals. The boy still hadn't spoken. Marcus crouched down beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're all right," he murmured, not as comfort, but as declaration. "They don't get to define what this was." Jalen looked up at him, eyes glassy with confusion more than fear now. "I didn't even say anything," he whispered. Marcus nodded once. "That's the part that scares them. You didn't need to." From across the sidewalk, Officer Veller approached again, flanked by the same supervisor who had earlier ordered all recording devices kept active. Veller's tone was sharper now, posturing. "For the record, sir, the dog responded to perceived non-compliance. I issued clear commands." "Which ones?" Marcus cut in, standing now, his voice quiet but no longer soft. "Because the command to a dog is not a command to a child. And I heard conflicting orders to my son. Stand still, then move back. That's confusion, not compliance." Veller's face flushed. "We're not here to debate protocol." "No," Marcus agreed. "You're here to document failure." The supervisor stepped between them. "Let's not escalate this further. We'll be conducting an internal review. I'll be conducting a formal complaint on multiple grounds, and I'm declining any informal resolution offers should they arise." Marcus glanced down at his watch and noted the time aloud. 5:23 p.m., recording that for context. Veller scoffed. "Sir, I'm trying to say this was a safety response." "No," Marcus replied, calm as steel. "You're trying to shape a narrative before the footage defines its own." The supervisor exhaled. "Understood. We'll note your position." As if cued, bystanders who had gathered slowly began to disperse. Some offered brief nods to Marcus. Others spoke in hushed tones, murmuring words like reckless and unnecessary. A few remained behind, holding their phones slightly raised, recording everything until the last cruiser left. Marcus turned to Jalen again, helping him rise to his feet. The boy was shaky, but upright. As they walked toward their vehicle, Marcus paused, scanning the area with deliberate focus. The dog was gone. The crowd was thinning. The officers were packing up. But in Marcus's mind, the next phase had already begun. "Dad?" Jalen asked, his voice still low. "Is it over now?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Some fights happen later, not now." As they reached the car, Marcus opened the back door for his son, then turned one last time, eyes locking with the street camera across the intersection. He noted its angle, the timestamp on the squad car's display, and the final position of every officer on site. Records, timestamps, names. The tools were already assembled. The frame was set, and Marcus Hale never built anything halfway. Some endings are not loud, but they are permanent. Marcus didn't speak a word on the drive home. The roads of Northbridge passed by in quiet procession, familiar, orderly, and unprepared for what had unfolded just hours earlier. When they reached the house, Jalen stepped inside first, clutching the antiseptic packet a medic had handed him, still dazed but trying to appear composed. Marcus followed behind, locking the door with a deliberate click. Then, without removing his coat, he walked straight to his study. He opened the drawer with a mechanical calm and slid out a thick binder labeled in neat black lettering, "Public Safety Oversight, Northbridge Case Studies." He didn't hesitate. Each tabbed section in the binder was a blueprint: policy analysis, city council proposals, litigation summaries. It wasn't just research. It was the very scaffolding of the system that had now turned against him. He sat at the desk, breathing slowly. His mind was a courtroom before a trial, orderly, cold, focused. He flipped the binder open and began scanning the checklist he had once taught municipalities to use in assessing use-of-force cases. Irony thickened with each box he mentally ticked off. Failure to de-escalate. Check. Improper K-9 deployment. Check. Unlawful detainment of a minor. Check. Tampering with evidence. Check. Outside the study, Jalen's footsteps echoed faintly as he paced the hallway, unsure whether to ask something or stay silent. Marcus called without turning. "Get some rest, son. I just need to write a few things down." Jalen hesitated, then said, "You're not going to let them get away with it, right?" Marcus looked toward the door, his voice steady. "No. But I won't scream either. I'll write it so well they can't erase it." He began drafting a full incident timeline. He synced the phone footage from nearby witnesses with local business camera angles he had memorized in the moment. He reviewed the street lamp logs that automatically pinged when emergency frequencies spiked. On another screen, he pulled the body cam activation timestamps from public access archives. Time codes aligned like puzzle pieces under his fingertips. It was late, but his mind moved faster with each passing hour. At 11:42 p.m., the first formal complaint was filed. It included annotated images, street camera angles, the audio transcript from Marcus's own recorded voice citing badge numbers, and a timeline accurate to the second. He did not mark it as a citizen complaint. He marked it under the legal clause for institutional failure of protective policy enforcement. Just as he was about to send the secondary report, a notification flashed, an encrypted message from an unknown address. It read, "You should have this. Don't know what they'll do, but you should have it." Attached was a document labeled Northbridge K-9 Handler Directive, Training Log 2A Confidential. Marcus opened it slowly, suspicion sharpening his focus. Inside was every training session assigned to Officer Veller's unit. More importantly, it included 3 internal notes marked "Do not deploy in public, uncontrolled settings" for that exact dog. 3 warnings, all ignored. He leaned back. His eyes didn't widen, but his jaw tightened. "So the leash broke long before today," he murmured. At 12:16 a.m., he updated the report, appending the training log as an exhibit and noting the anonymous source as unverified but corroborative. Then he began drafting 5 distinct complaints, each tied to separate sections of the Municipal Code. 3504. Misuse of force, K-9 deployment without threat justification. 3505. Unlawful detainment and endangerment of a minor. 3506. Suppression and tampering of recording devices. 3507. Violation of Supervisory Oversight Protocol 3508. Failure to initiate public safety review. After K-9 use, each was written not with anger, but with finality, the kind of finality that made appeals impossible. At 1:08 a.m., he uploaded the bundle to 3 different legal repositories, 1 local, 1 state level, 1 federal. He did not wait for acknowledgments. He knew the systems would clock the submissions, and that was all he needed. By 1:30, allies had already begun responding. A retired city attorney texted, "Saw the video. You've got grounds, solid ones. Loop me in." A former client messaged, "That's your boy, right? I've got news contacts if you need." Even a former police supervisor Marcus once sparred with on policy reform simply wrote, "Ready when you are." The network began humming, quietly, unstoppably. Marcus looked out the window. The neighborhood was still, but something beneath it had begun to move. He returned to his desk and opened a new document titled Hale v. Northbridge Department. Incident A. 1 Summary. He began typing the introduction with the same steady fingers he once used to draft city ordinances. Each sentence laid like bricks in a wall no one would see until it stood too tall to ignore. Behind him, the house remained silent. But this time, it wasn't helpless silence. It was the quiet before impact. He paused only once, reaching for the binder and tapping the spine thoughtfully. Then he wrote the final line of his nightly journal and underlined it with resolve. "Justice rarely knocks. It builds a door where none was offered." The video surfaced online without warning. 37 seconds of grainy sidewalk footage capturing Marcus Hale stepping between his son and a lunging K-9, arm outstretched, voice calm, as the handler lost control. It didn't come from a news outlet. It wasn't shared by authorities. It came from a parent, a bystander across the street who had begun filming just before the chaos peaked. Within hours, the clip was reposted across platforms, captioned only with, "This happened right outside the track center. That's a child." By noon the next day, it had spread beyond Northbridge. Local journalists reached out, eager to place Marcus in front of a camera. Talk show producers offered travel stipends. Civil rights advocates tweeted his name. But Marcus answered no calls, gave no interviews. He hadn't built a case for attention. He had built it for precedent. In the quiet of his study, beneath framed degrees and stacks of annotated legal codes, Marcus opened a new document. At the top, he typed in bold letters, "The Hale Defense Initiative." It wasn't a foundation or charity. It was a pseudonym, a firewall between media frenzy and legal firepower. Over the next 24 hours, Marcus filed 8 civil suits simultaneously, each one distinct, each tethered to a precise timestamp in the footage. Misuse of force, unlawful detainment of a minor, procedural failure of K-9 management, suppression of recording devices. His objective was no longer survival. It was structural accountability. But something unexpected arrived before his filings reached the court registrar. A burner email, no subject, no name. Inside, a batch of leaked screenshots, internal Northbridge communications messages between officers. The tone was casual, callous. One message stood out in particular. A different officer, not Veller, had written, "We'll bury it like the last one." That line hit Marcus like a ledger being cracked open. It wasn't about his case anymore. It was about a pattern. He sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, absorbing what the leak implied. There had been others, other families, other silences. The phrase, "like the last one," suggested a routine, not a mistake. Marcus saved the files, encrypted them threefold, then printed one page, just that message, and pinned it to his corkboard. Proof of habit. A seed of culture, rotten and rooted. The department tried to get ahead of the story. A deputy press statement framed the footage as a regrettable misunderstanding pending review. But denial came too late. Community pages flooded with testimonies. Parents who remembered similar confrontations. A former teacher who had once been detained outside a youth center. And footage kept appearing. Old phone recordings, grainy images. One showed a dog straining its leash near another teenager 2 years prior, same handler. The silence had been long, but now it cracked. Marcus pushed hearings forward, each one built with precision. Witness lists, street camera logs, audio extractions. His legal filings became living architecture, interlocking, reinforcing, exposing. He didn't argue for punishment. He argued for verification, for timelines, for chain of command. His strategy was never vengeance. It was clarity. Inside one of the early hearings, Marcus sat quietly as Officer Veller's counsel attempted to recast the incident. They called it a misinterpreted command. They blamed the dog's recent training cycle. But Marcus, leaning forward at the plaintiff's table, placed the leaked message on the overhead projector. "We'll bury it like the last one." The room fell silent. The judge, middle-aged and stone-faced, asked only one question. "Is this verified?" Marcus replied, "It came from someone inside your system." Suspension notices followed. Not just for Veller, but for 2 communications officers and 1 supervisor who had quietly tampered with footage timestamps. Legal stalls emerged, delays, procedural motions, requests for redaction. But Marcus had built every piece of his initiative to withstand those tactics. He had studied the loopholes long before they were used against him. Each hearing grew in weight, not because of outbursts or courtroom drama, but because of the people who filled the seats behind Marcus, fathers, teachers, retired engineers, students with notebooks. They didn't chant or clap. They listened. They recorded. They stood up, one by one, to confirm what they saw. At home, Jalen asked Marcus once, "Why don't you talk to the news?" Marcus looked at his son, the boy who had once stumbled backward on a sidewalk, and answered, "Because truth isn't a headline. It's what you prove when no one's clapping." In another courtroom, across the street from the city office building, the department's lead legal advisor whispered to a colleague, "This won't end with Veller." It didn't. By the end of the week, 3 more officers were placed under review. A data subpoena revealed the flagging of residential names, including Jalen's, triggered by vague compliance risk metrics. But that would come to light later. For now, Marcus walked alone out of the courthouse, briefcase in hand, flanked by no cameras, no applause. Just an initiative, growing. Quietly, deliberately, unstoppable. Silence may protect careers, but truth rearranges the architecture of power. The officer smirked, confident his act would go unpunished, unaware that every move, every witness, and every piece of evidence had already been anticipated by a father who doesn't tolerate harm to his family. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when strategy meets unstoppable legal power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The courtroom doors opened not with fanfare, but with the rustle of papers and the hush of anticipation. The gallery filled quickly. Community members, legal observers, policy students, and a few journalists with silent recorders. But all eyes eventually settled on the man who entered without a word, briefcase in one hand, a binder tucked beneath the other. Marcus Hale did not glance at the cameras. He walked straight ahead, nodding once to the civil rights attorney seated in the front row, and took his place beside them at the lead counsel's table. This wasn't the beginning of a complaint. It was the architecture of reckoning. The presiding judge, a stern-looking man named Ronald Caron, adjusted his glasses and gavelled in the hearing. This court is now in session regarding the matter of Hale versus Northbridge Department of Public Safety. His voice carried, but it was Marcus's presence that anchored the room. He sat not as a victim, but as an architect of legal consequence, surrounded by a team of male experts, lawyers, psychologists, audit specialists, all united by a single goal: to challenge the system that had endangered a child and nearly erased its own culpability. The prosecution began with body camera footage. Officer Grant Veller's voice echoed from the speakers, sharp, uncertain, commanding a K-9 to engage without provocation. The jury winced as the dog lunged, as the father stepped between, as the child fell. But Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the screen, tracking every frame, every timestamp. A second clip followed, external footage from a store camera showing the moment from a different angle. The dog's leash snapped taut. Jalen's hands hit the pavement. Marcus's body moved with surgical precision to shield him. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier with each second of playback. But that was only the surface. When the playback ended, Marcus stood. His voice, when he spoke, was even and deliberate. "Your Honor, what you've just seen is not an accident. It is the inevitable result of a system with faulty wiring, and that wiring begins long before the leash is ever unclipped." From there, the hearing widened. The defense attempted to downplay the aggression as a misunderstanding, but Marcus's legal team had already mapped out something deeper. Civil records were introduced, documents showing the K-9 unit had not undergone updated certification in nearly 7 years. Budgetary reports revealed reallocated funds, resources stripped from officer training programs and funneled toward outdated K-9 maintenance. Marcus leaned forward, presenting spreadsheets and audit trails, each page a quiet indictment. "Negligence doesn't always wear a badge," he said. "Sometimes it wears a spreadsheet." Then came the department's attempt to settle. The city's legal counsel, a thin man named Robert Casson, rose with a hesitant tone. "Mr. Hale, in the interest of protecting all parties from prolonged distress, we're prepared to offer a settlement that includes a formal apology, internal review, and—" "No," Marcus interrupted, not unkindly but without room for argument. "This isn't about apology. It's about architecture. I'm not asking for something polite. I'm asking for something permanent." The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The refusal landed like a weight across the gallery. For a moment it seemed as though the courtroom might pivot back toward the ordinary. But Marcus's next move pulled it into uncharted territory. "Your Honor," his lawyer said, standing beside him now, "we respectfully request to call a new witness, former Chief Darren Rallin." The request stirred the room. Whispers flared. The man in question, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, once the face of the Northbridge Department, stepped forward from the gallery. He took the oath with steady hands, but his eyes darted toward Marcus with a flicker of guilt already visible. Under oath, Rallin confirmed suspicions that Marcus had long feared but never publicly spoken. "There was," A program, he admitted, his voice brittle with weight. It started 6 years ago. Residents who were flagged during minor confrontations, curfews, traffic stops, property disputes were added to a quiet risk list. The room froze. Marcus didn't move. His eyes narrowed, his hands folded tightly. We called it a non-compliance flag system, Rowland continued, but it wasn't official policy. It was discretionary. The defense team leaned forward. And these flags, did they influence officer response? Yes, Rowland replied, almost whispering now. They were used to justify escalation protocols. And was the minor, Jalen Hale, flagged? A beat. Yes. The moment Officer Veller radioed for backup and entered his ID, the flag triggered. That's why. That's why the dog unit responded with priority. The silence that followed was not just disbelief. It was devastation. The courtroom recoiled. Even the judge paused, his gavel unmoving. From the gallery, a father stood. Another leaned forward. The weight of what was revealed was not procedural, it was cultural, systemic. And Marcus Hale, who had entered the room prepared to defend his son, now stood as the man holding the key to a concealed, unconstitutional machine. He stood again, slower this time, and turned to face the room. My son was not a risk. He was a child. What this flag system did was not protect the public. It protected an illusion. And now, with this revelation, we don't just have misconduct. We have motive. We have architecture built to blame silence, to escalate innocence. Cameras clicked softly in the background. The gallery had stopped whispering. There was nothing left to say. Marcus returned to his seat, composed. But his eyes were different now. He no longer carried the burden of proving the moment. He now carried the blueprint of what had almost been buried. Some trials are not about what was done, but what was almost buried. The court transcript wasn't the climax. The neighborhood wasn't the battlefield. It was this, an unmarked house on Brinton Street, where the real war began. Marcus Hale stood in front of the weather-worn door of a modest home with a rusted mailbox and peeling paint. In his hand was a legal envelope with Exhibit 9C inside, a document proving that the residents of this house, an elderly father and his 2 sons, had been falsely flagged as pre-risk subjects by the Northbridge PD's now-exposed internal program. They weren't even aware. Marcus had traced the code embedded in their case report, 117-KJ-N, identical to Jalen's. Same officer, same timestamp, same weaponized assumption. He rang the doorbell once. When the younger son answered, Marcus didn't introduce himself as a father. He introduced himself as the man who had just filed his 11th suit. "This isn't about one family anymore," he said, voice even, gaze firm. "It's about the entire network they tried to build beneath our feet." By the end of the day, Marcus had signed the necessary waivers to represent 4 additional families pro bono. The Hale Defense Initiative, originally a quiet legal folder on his desk, now had a real-time database, media liaisons, 3 junior attorneys, and a forensic audit team led by a former federal compliance officer named Darren Kestel. Darren, a soft-spoken man with a paper-strewn office and a prosthetic arm from a training incident years ago, read through Marcus's documentation and looked up with something between disbelief and admiration. "You mapped their internal behavior patterns like an engineer," he said. "I didn't want to be right," Marcus replied, "but I had to be ready." The scope widened. Each of the newly filed 11 suits was surgically precise. One targeted an internal memo that had downgraded body cam footage retention to 3 days. Another exposed manipulated timestamps on training logs for K9 Unit 7. Each suit was a scalpel. Not one was emotional in tone, but each one carried the emotional weight of every child profiled, every father restrained, every system that chose convenience over character. The department began to unravel under pressure. A local insurer issued a notice of policy reevaluation. The city council, backed into a corner, called for emergency oversight meetings. For the first time in its history, Northbridge PD's Internal Affairs Division was placed under state supervision. Marcus's home became a command center. His old study now had wall-to-wall monitors. Dossiers were labeled by neighborhood, not name, an intentional strategy to prevent profiling within the very movement that fought it. Jalen, though still quiet and healing, watched it all. He asked questions sometimes, short ones. Why that street? Why do they call it flagging? Marcus would pause whatever he was doing and answer with care. Because they hope we don't notice, but we do. One evening, as another set of court notices were filed, Jalen placed a single printed quote on the corkboard above the monitors. It was the line he'd been writing in his journal for weeks but hadn't told his father. My father didn't raise his voice, he raised the system. The bronze plaque beneath the street lamp caught sunlight just as the first school bus pulled up across the road. Its inscription, clean and spare, read, "This ground changed policy." There were no names, no titles, just that one sentence, etched in steel and silence. Inside the newly reopened Northbridge Community Center, now renamed the Hale Justice Pavilion, footsteps echoed through a space reborn. The atrium was lined with interactive exhibits, muted silver lighting glowing from beneath polished glass panels. One display showed a looping timeline with arresting simplicity, a still image of a lunging K9 frozen mid-frame, time-stamped to the second, gradually shifting into legislation scrolls bearing state seals. Each panel carried legal filings, community testimonies, and heat maps of reform ripple effects. It was not a museum of tragedy, it was a blueprint of resistance. Jalen Hale, now 15, walked slowly beside his classmates, all boys from various districts brought in for a youth civic awareness tour. He didn't speak much, he just gestured. Here, the lawsuit that banned unaudited K9 usage. There, the footage submission policy that stemmed from his father's evidence protocols. And here, he paused at a tall steel pillar, the first case that forced emergency hearings statewide. Behind the walls, in a sealed consultation room just beyond public access, Marcus Hale stood in quiet conversation with two state advisors. He wore no suit, no badge, no marker of influence. He spoke plainly but with gravity, laying out the blueprint for cross-state policy replication. He was not there to be honored, he was there to finish the architecture. His objectives had shifted, not softened. Action had become structure. "They're going to ask you again," one advisor said, tapping his folder. "The Civic Heroism Award, Lifetime Impact. We'd fly you out next week." Marcus barely looked up. If they give the credit to a face, they'll wait for the next face to fix what's broken. Let the system remember the correction, not the name. The advisor sat back. "You know, most people would." "I'm not most people," Marcus replied. "Not with pride, but finality." Out in the atrium, Jalen reached the last display, a bench engraved with the names of every youth who submitted formal statements during the hearings. He ran his fingers across one. Devin Merrick, age 13, statement number 6. The bench faced the east window, where early sunlight now splashed over the reorganized neighborhood field. What once felt like a minefield of assumptions now felt navigable. Not safe, not perfect, but changed. From across the hall, an unfamiliar young officer walked by. He was alone, off duty, but his posture changed as he saw Marcus exiting the consultation wing. There was no salute, no official gesture, just a pause, a nod, and 2 words. "Thank you." Marcus met his eyes. His response was simple, steady, a return nod. No need for names. Outside, the sidewalk stretched back to the corner where it all began. The dog, the leash, the fear, the fight. It hadn't been repaved, but there were new signs now, new cameras, a different air. What had started with Marcus shielding his son from a K9 had transformed into something far wider, something without sirens or headlines. A framework, a movement, a resistance that lived in protocol and public record. He walked the path with Jalen that afternoon, just as they had walked it a year before. This time, there were no officers nearby, no dog leash, no noise, just the wind. Jalen looked up. "Do you think people even remember how it started?" Marcus smiled faintly, touching the edge of the bench. "Maybe not." He paused, his voice quiet but resolute. "But it's better if the system forgets the name but remembers the correction." Not all leaders step forward. Some stay behind to hold the door open. Jalen stood behind the wooden podium, fingers lightly trembling against the edge as the microphone crackled to life. The room had grown silent the moment he stepped up, silent in that thick, expectant way that presses against your chest. The youth council event had drawn a full house, students from every school in the district, teachers lined along the back, a few local reporters and a panel of city leaders perched behind a long table. The lights above him hummed faintly, casting soft shadows on the cream-colored walls. "I was 14, Jalen began, his voice uncertain but audible, "when I learned that fear can be mistaken for guilt." He paused. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on his father seated in the second row, silent and still. The memory hit Jalen like the first blast of winter air, sharp, unforgettable. "It happened outside the community complex," he continued, gaining steadiness. "I was just walking with my dad. We weren't doing anything, just talking about track practice." No one moved. The officer gave a command. Not to me, not to my dad, to a dog. He breathed in. It lunged. Gasps didn't echo, but the shift in posture across the audience was clear. Backs straightened, phones lowered, breath held. Jalen didn't flinch this time. He leaned into the silence, his voice a little stronger. "I didn't move at first. Not because I was being difficult. Not because I was defying anything. I froze because I didn't know what would make it worse. Speak? Move? Blink wrong?" One of the panel members scribbled something on a notepad. Another stopped mid-sip of water. "I've learned since then," Jalen said, "that people sometimes see silence as a threat. But silence isn't defiance. Sometimes it's just someone waiting to feel safe." His hands were no longer shaking. He lifted his chin slightly. "My dad didn't yell that day. He didn't fight back. He made sure the cameras saw everything. Because sometimes that's the only voice the system understands. Proof, not pain." The crowd remained riveted. Jalen's voice softened. "What I'm trying to say is, if you've ever been told that staying calm made you suspicious, or that not talking fast enough meant you were hiding something, you're not alone." A wave of emotion moved through the room like a breeze through tall grass. "My dad taught me how to read shadows, not just signs, that sometimes what you don't say can save your life, but it can also cost you your name." That sentence lingered. Then came the moment no one expected. A man rose slowly from the back of the room. Gray hair, dark coat, stiff movements. His badge was gone, but his presence still carried the imprint of service. Jalen noticed him immediately. The man walked forward, hesitating only once as if rehearsing what came next. After the speech ended, while students swarmed with questions and praise, the man approached quietly. "I'm not here to defend anything," he said in a voice that had weathered command. "I was a K-9 handler, 23 years. Jalen stood still, heart thudding again, but this time not from fear. "I saw the footage," the man continued. "That dog was trained to obey mechs, mechanical sequence cues, but it paused when you spoke. That's not normal." He exhaled. "That pause was conscience. Yours, not the dog's." Jalen didn't know what to say, but his instincts guided him. He extended a hand. The man shook it, firmly, genuinely. "I left the force 2 weeks after that," he said quietly, "because I realized I'd spent years choosing to obey, instead of choosing to think." A camera flashed somewhere near the edge of the room. one of the student photographers capturing the moment. That image would later become the cover of the Hale Initiative's new chapter on youth leadership. Marcus didn't rise. He just watched from his seat, still and proud. He understood what had just happened. This was the ripple, the one that keeps moving after the stone has long since fallen. Back at the podium, Jalen offered one final glance at the students before stepping down. The room stood in hushed admiration, not for a viral moment, but for a living one. Even the loudest stories need a quiet moment to remember what changed. The lawsuits settled quietly, but their ripples were anything but. Each agreement came with a condition, and not a single one involved money. The demand was structural reform, permanent change, embedded into the very processes that had failed. Marcus Hale sat across from the last mediation table of the year, his suit pressed but plain, eyes unmoved. He listened as legal counsel read aloud the revised youth engagement protocols now mandated across 3 precincts. Behind the calm exterior, his thoughts raced, not with emotion, but with assessment. Every clause had to hold. Every word had to last. By year's end, all 22 suits he had filed reached resolution. Officer training manuals were rewritten. Detainment procedures for minors required third-party review. K-9 unit deployment around juveniles was suspended pending federal oversight. One department disbanded its entire unit. Another installed civilian monitors in dispatch. The momentum had become undeniable. Yet Marcus refused every podium. When the Northbridge Times requested an interview for their Community Guardian feature, he redirected them to a local father whose child had been misprofiled. When a civil liberties conference invited him to speak, he nominated a youth counselor from a nearby ward instead. "What about you?" one reporter asked bluntly, catching him outside a hearing. "I'm already spoken for," Marcus replied quietly, eyes shifting toward Jalen in the distance. It wasn't humility. It was architecture. The reforms didn't slow. Somewhere in the back rooms of the Department of Civic Oversight, a new proposal circulated, a federal initiative modeled on his work. It bore a temporary name, the Hale Statute. Drafted by lawmakers he had never met, based on a cascade of legal victories he never celebrated publicly. It was no longer just Northbridge, it was national. Then came the letter, delivered by Standard Post, addressed to Marcus Hale in clean but slightly smudged handwriting. The return address was unmistakable, a correctional facility just north of Eden Grove. He didn't open it right away. It sat on the corner of his desk for a day, then 2. On the 3rd night, with the house quiet and Jalen asleep, Marcus slit the envelope open with a letter opener shaped like a gavel, an old gift from a policy conference long ago. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. Officer Veller's words were measured but unvarnished. "I'm writing this from a place I never imagined I'd end up, not just physically but in understanding. I was trained to see non-compliance first, not context, to measure silence as risk. What I did to your son wasn't just wrong, it was learned. And that's not an excuse, it's a confession." Marcus read it once. His jaw didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't rise. He read it again, slower. Then he reached behind his desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and filed the letter into a folder labeled simply, "Reckoning." No reply. No postmark. Just preservation. The air shifted in the following weeks. Journalists dug deeper, lawmakers called more frequently. Marcus's inbox flooded with requests from scholars, policy analysts, even an international human rights council. He responded to none directly. Instead, he drafted referral lists, pointing each to local leaders and advocates who had filed parallel complaints in their own towns. He understood the risk of centralizing credit. He wasn't the story. The reform was. Meanwhile, Jalen had changed. Once a quiet teen hesitant to relive the day, he now held a different strength. He'd begun mentoring other boys profiled or mistreated by law enforcement, some younger, some older, all quietly carrying their own wounds. They gathered in small workshops held at the civic library, forming discussion circles and writing prompts. Jalen's journal, once his private way of coping, became their guide. Together with a retired legal editor from Marcus's network, the boys compiled their reflections into a printed booklet. It bore a stark, simple title on the cover: "What They Saw Wasn't Me." During the first session where copies were handed out, Jalen stood up awkwardly to speak. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he said, shifting from foot to foot, hands tucked behind his back. "It's about how we teach people to see who we are before they decide who they think we are." The room fell still. Not a camera in sight, just presence, the kind that couldn't be faked, bought, or erased. Outside, winter had settled. Snow dusted the curb near the sidewalk where it had all begun. And inside Marcus's study, case folders lined the bookshelf not as trophies, but as blueprints, each one labeled with names, not numbers. He glanced toward the window. Somewhere out there, another child walked beside his father. Somewhere, an officer hesitated for the first time. Somewhere, a policy shifted mid-paragraph. The story hadn't ended. It had simply changed form. Some stories do not end. They shift into tools. Marcus's shoes tapped gently against the sidewalk, those same pale concrete slabs that had once echoed chaos, commands, and the violent snap of a leash. He walked beside his son, Jalen, now taller, older, but still trailing the shadow of that day like a line drawn faintly in chalk. There was no fanfare, no cameras, just two men retracing the steps that had once unraveled the silence of a broken system. The air was crisp. Evening had begun to settle, soft light brushing the edges of street signs and trimmed hedges. But even the light had changed here. New street lamps now carried dual-bulb systems, one for visibility, the other equipped with discreet, city-approved surveillance. On the fourth lamp post, past the entrance to the community field, a bronze plaque caught Jalen's eye. He stopped without warning, tilting his head slightly, reading aloud. This ground changed policy. Marcus halted beside him, squinting as if reading it for the first time, though he knew it had been installed weeks ago. His fingers reached out slowly, tracing the edges of the plaque with a faint tremor, not from weakness, but from weight. Beneath it, small etchings of case numbers and legislative codes shimmered faintly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "They finally put it in," Marcus said quietly. Jalen nodded. "It doesn't feel like victory, just stillness." "Stillness is sometimes louder than applause," Marcus replied, his gaze drifting toward the trimmed hedges flanking the edge of the field. He could still remember the moment his son fell there, the dog's lunge, the scatter of onlookers, and the split-second decisions that turned a quiet day into a movement. As they resumed walking, Jalen slowed again, spotting a newly installed bench tucked beneath a line of maple trees. Upon its dark wooden surface, a bronze strip had been embedded. It listed names, not prominent ones but real ones. Youth, students, witnesses, boys who had stood in courtrooms, offered statements, refused silence. "There's my friend Kieran," Jalen whispered, pointing at the second name from the left. He couldn't even finish his sentence when he testified. He just cried. Marcus placed a steady hand on Jalen's shoulder. But he stood. That's all the record needed. A light breeze rustled the trees, scattering a few early leaves across the sidewalk. Jalen turned toward his father, eyes searching. "Do you still think about it?" he asked. "That moment." Marcus looked ahead, toward the far end of the sidewalk where it curved near the maintenance road and out of view. "I think about how close we came to being a forgotten footnote," he answered, "how thin the line is between silence and record." As if summoned by memory, the distant hum of footsteps grew closer. From the far bend, a patrol officer appeared, young, no older than 25. He walked without urgency, his hand resting lightly on his belt, not gripping anything. His uniform was new. His stride was even. When he reached the pair, He slowed but didn't stop. His eyes flicked toward Marcus, then Jalen. No hesitation, no posturing. "Thank you," the officer said simply. It wasn't a performance. No gesture of grand recognition. Just 3 words, offered plainly. Marcus met his eyes and gave a nod. "Stay safe." The officer nodded once in return and kept walking. No names, no ceremony. Jalen exhaled, a quiet breath that had carried years in its lungs. That felt different. "It was," Marcus replied, "because this time it wasn't performative. It was recognition." The field beside them had been reseeded. A fresh coat of paint marked the basketball court lines. Surveillance signs stood discreetly near the entrances, not as threats, but as acknowledgments of accountability. Marcus knew that most passers-by would never understand the significance. That was fine. It was never about being understood. It was about being safe. Jalen slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. "Do you ever miss being part of it? The hearings, the letters, the courtrooms?" Marcus shook his head. "You don't miss fire once it's done burning. You just use the light it gave." They reached the final stretch of sidewalk, the one that ran past the storefronts where Marcus had once counted cameras and recorded timestamps like a surgeon preparing for incision. Only now, he didn't count. He didn't have to. Jalen stepped off the curb for a moment to tie his shoe, glancing back once more at the field, the bench, the plaque. Then he looked up at his father, his voice quiet but firm. "You didn't raise your voice," he said. "You raised the system." Marcus gave no reply, just a small smile, steady, reflective. And as they resumed their walk, side by side down the changed but familiar path, the last sunlight of the day caught the edge of the bronze plaque one more time, casting a faint golden hue across the sidewalk. Not a spotlight, just a reminder. The sidewalk stayed the same, but the system walking on it did not. Seconds later, the lawsuits were filed, careers ended, and the cops' arrogance evaporated instantly as accountability took full effect. If you believe real authority strikes decisively, with precision, foresight, and unyielding force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, racism, and the power of legal accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, responsibility, and protecting the vulnerable.